Call to order. Thank you for being here. I think many people got caught up in the rain, which we're not complaining about. We need the rain, so continue raining, please. I'd like to call the Non-Active Management Area Groundwater Committee to order and welcome you all for being here, and look forward to continuing working with you. On your places, I have made a colored copy of the Arizona State Constitution, Article 2, Section 2. It spells out the purpose of government. I would request you take it and frame it and put it on your wall like I have mine at the office. Also is the last meeting I passed out the red and white map of the country that shows the white in private hands. This meeting I have given you the state map. What you see in white is in private hands. And in the late 90s, we had work that was completed that showed that we had 13% of land in private hands. Out of that 13%, we have land trusts, conservation easements, churches, and the like that are non-taxable. So that detracts from the usable taxable revenue that our counties and local governments have. So take a look at those, and if you have any questions, please, I'm sure you'll let me know. But I just want to welcome you, and I look forward to this meeting and continued meetings. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Jamie Kelly. I represent Mojave County Water Authority. It's nice to see everybody here. I think we have a lot to get through today. We have a presentation, and then we have some matters to discuss after that. So perhaps we should start by introducing ourselves. And I'm Jamie Kelly, and I'll pass to the right.
Good morning. I'm Carol Ward. I'm Deputy Assistant Director with the Department of Water Resources.
Chris Custis, EDF and Water for Arizona Coalition. Chuck Podolak, SRP.
Cheryl Lombard, Valley Partnership.
Don Bills, Coconino Plateau Water Partnership.
Spencer Camps, Home Builders Association of Central Arizona.
Patrick Bray, Arizona Farm and Ranch Group, filling in for Bass Aha.
Tom Farley, Letta Partners.
Holly Irwin, La Paz County Supervisor, District 3.
Craig Sullivan, County Supervisors Association.
Stephanie Smallhouse, Arizona Farm Bureau.
Patrick Cunningham, we represent Mojave County. Christian Stump with the Nature Conservancy.
And News Designee for Lisa Atkins, State Land Department.
Ron Doba, NAMWA.
Terry Sue Rossi, Arizona Water Company.
Senator Lisa Otondo, LD4.
Wade Noble, Yuma County Agriculture Water Coalition.
Sharon Modesto, ADWR.
Keith Nelson, ADWR Groundwater Flow Modeling Section.
Good morning, Jeff Inwood, Chief Hydrologist at ADWR.
I'm Representative Gail Griffin, LD14. Here we have a presentation by ADWR on the status of groundwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, my name is Jeff Inwood, Chief Hydrologist here at ADWR. Our presentation today will be a tag team between myself and Keith Nelson to my left. I'll be starting, Keith will jump in the middle, and then I'll pick up at the end. So to start, just want to reiterate one of the committee's goals that we will be focusing on here today, which is to achieve a baseline understanding of Arizona groundwater outside of active management areas. Today we're going to cover a general overview of water use in Arizona with a focus on groundwater, as well as talking about a number of wells and the type of wells in and around the state. Keith will then take over and talk about the models that we've produced here in the department and others that we know about, as well as talking about an example model, which will be the Wilcox model. We chose that one specifically just because it's the most recent model that's been released by the department. outside of an active management area. Keith will also focus in on recharge and how it's related to models. And then I will pick up again at the end to talk about supply and demand issues around the state. So starting out very basic, 4 basic types of water sources in the state of Arizona: groundwater, Colorado River water, surface water, which are the in-state streams, and reclaimed water, water that's being that is reclaimed from a previous use and then used for another purpose. And if you look as of 2017, the way statewide the different types of water are used is shown here on the screen with a focus on groundwater, which is the largest source of water around the state. I'll point out the Colorado River number has decreased a little bit in the last couple of years due to water that's being left in Lake Mead. Moving on, this is a map that was produced by the Water Resources Research Center at the U of A. It's a few years old, but the point that we wanted to make here is that, well, first let me point out, so the basins in green are those that have over 75% of the water use comes from groundwater. The blue basins are where surface water is the dominant water use, over 75%. And then the non-colored or clear whitish basins are a combination of both groundwater, surface water, and in some cases reclaimed water. So the pie charts that you see up there match. Blue is surface water, green is groundwater, and the orange represents reclaimed water. Without having each of you count them up, 31 of the basins are groundwater dominated. There's only 4 that are surface water dominated, and the remaining basins are a combination, some of which are more heavily surface water or groundwater, some with reclaimed water use. Looking at the number of wells, what this number represents, number of withdrawal wells, as of, this is a 2017 data, withdrawal wells. So what we've done is we've filtered out non-withdrawal wells. These are typically geotechnical wells, cathodic protection, canceled or abandoned wells, or monitor wells. So there's roughly 159,000 wells around the state that are used for withdrawal purposes. The majority of them, 122,000 approximately, are exempt wells that have small withdrawal capacities less than 35 gallons a minute. And the remaining 37,000 wells are non-exempt wells, the larger wells that have pumping capacities greater than 35 gallons a minute. Another thing to point out, the department receives roughly 3,000 applications for wells, NOIs, a year, give or take. Now, looking at number of wells and wells pumping capacity, and I want to spell out that pumping capacity is not the same as water pumped. When notice of intent to drill are submitted to the department, they usually, most of them have a pumping capacity listed that's projected. In addition, well, after wells are drilled, if there is a pump completion report that's submitted, it would also have a pumping capacity. But that is not the same as water pumped that's measured or estimated. On the right is a pie chart showing the number of wells. On the left is the pumping capacity. when we've broken these pie charts into 4 categories, non-exempt inside AMAs and INAs, exempt inside AMAs and INAs, non-exempt outside AMAs, INAs, and exempt outside AMAs and INAs. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, non-exempt wells account for 23% of the total number of wells statewide, but that represents over 95% of the pumping capacity. So what you're looking at there is on the right, the blue and the gray pie slices are the 23%, and on the right, the same colors, blue and gray, represent the pumping capacity. Turning it around and looking the other way, there is 77% of the wells, which represents the yellow and the orange on the right-hand side, represent only 5% of the reported pumping capacity on the left-hand pie chart, the yellow and orange. Looking at the data a little differently, we provided that exempt, non-exempt well by county. The orange bars represent the non-exempt wells, and the blue bars represent the exempt wells, and this is percentage. And as you can see very clearly, and it's not unexpected, the non-exempt wells have by far the largest percentage of the pumping capacity in each county, and then the exempt wells are much smaller percentage. Moving on.
I have a question.
Yes.
Would you go back to the last slide?
Yes.
Okay, the non-exempt wells, are they water providers, or what's the breakout of those non-exempt wells? Do you have that?
Madam Chair, don't have that here. These are just exempt, non-exempt, not by the type of water use associated with them. So, well, were you looking for the type of water use or for the provider? Right, so that, yes.
Excuse me, we do have a breakdown somewhere of who those are. Are they water providers or private individual wells? Do we have that?
Do we have that here today?
Do you have it that you can provide?
That can be provided, yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Madam Chair, and another question for you. Do you have more updated numbers? These are all from 2017.
We don't have them currently. We can get them for you. So moving on, what we're going to talk about now, 2 things. On the map on the left is a map showing the index line of wells that the department has. There's over 1,800 dots. Those blue dots represent an individual index well. An index well is a well that the department has inventoried and is included in our water data collection efforts. So we monitor and collect water level data in those wells on a regular basis, generally annual, semi-annually, or quarterly. Again, 1,800 wells across the state. Currently, we are always trying to increase and add index wells to our line to measure, to get better data across the state. We do. back in business.
Madam Chair, a question. So the index wells do not include any sites on reservation lands in Arizona?
Yeah. It looks like there are, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't. Yeah, if there are, they're very minimal.
Okay, thank you.
So that's our index line on the left. On the right is a map showing water level change. I know it's very hard to read at this level, and I'm going to zoom into a couple areas here momentarily. But what we do at the department is we do a report on a regular basis showing water level changes over time. If you can see, the red dots on the map represent water level declines. This is a 10-year history map, so from 2006 to 2016. The blue dots represent water level increases over that time period. And I'm going to zoom into the southeast part of the state just as an example to show you in more detail what our data, how we present our data. We produce these water level change reports, and looking at the Wilcox Basin, which is the one farthest south and with the large red dots in the middle of it. That basin, I'll go through the statistics. Again, this is measuring water level change between 2006 and 2016. We have 30 wells in the Wilcox Basin that we have presented here. We have to obviously have the data over that entire time period, so that's why it's not a large number of wells. Out of the 30 wells, 29 of them show water level declines. Only one of them has a water level increase. The maximum decline was 62 feet. The one well that has the increase was a 28-foot increase. It's on the far west central part of the basin. And averaging all the water level changes for the Wilcox Basin from these wells only, the average is, over the 10-year period, is a decline of 26 feet.
Excuse me, question, Madam Chair. Can you please tell me how many of these wells have transducers on them?
Oops, sorry.
In the Wilcox area?
Yeah, these are, none of these do. These are manual measurements.
Manual measurements. And overall in the state, how many of the 1,800 wells have transducers?
Well, we have 130 approximately transducer sites currently. So you can see on the, no, it doesn't. On the map on the left does show the different colors represent the measuring frequencies. So the blue are annual, the red are quarterly. So we do have a map. I did not bring it today that does show the locations of our automated sites, the transducer sites.
If you could provide that to the committee, that would be very helpful. Thank you, Senator, for bringing that up.
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you.
Next, just moving a little to the east and a little further south, just wanted to point out.
Just one other question or statement. The Wilcox Basin is a closed basin. It's a little bit unique, a little different than the other basins that we have. Is that not correct?
That is correct, Madam Chair, and that's why I'm showing the Upper San Pedro now. That is not a closed basin, and we can look at the statistics for the same time period, 2006 to 2016, with a little more variation in this area.
Thank you.
So for the Upper San Pedro, again, for those, I'll point for those in this area right here. So in this basin, we have more wells that we have records for. There's 48 wells included. 32 of those wells show water level declines. The maximum decline over that 10-year period is 23 feet. There are 15 wells that show increases in water levels, and the maximum increase was 8 feet over the 10-year period. And there is one well that had no change. And if you average all of the declines and increases over the 10-year period, the average is a decline of 4 feet. So next, we're going to move into modeling discussion. I was going to turn it over to Keith. Obviously, there'll be questions. You can ask questions about this later, but if there's anything before we move on, I'll be glad to take any questions. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over now to Keith Nelson, our groundwater modeling section manager.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to talk a little bit about groundwater flow models in general, some of the department's models, and then some models developed by other folks. We're going to be flying probably at about 30,000 feet, make this discussion fairly non-technical. If anybody has some technical questions afterwards that you think of, you can feel free to send any questions or emails to Jeff or myself. So, because modeling does indeed get pretty involved. So the department has several groundwater flow models. We have an active modeling program for each of the 5 active management areas. Some of the models have some pretty interesting, unique, novel features. For example, the Pinell model. It's basically the first regional scale model that that incorporated the release of water from interbed storage due to subsidence, and added about 2.5 million acre-feet to this simulation. That's never been done before on a regional scale. And then the Santa Cruz AMA, because of the sensitivity and importance of flood recharge, but the uncertainty, we actually had a stochastic model developed to couple into our existing groundwater flow models. So anyway, we have staff continually working on updating the AMA models, and until recently, the department's coverage of groundwater flow models outside of AMAs have been pretty thin. But in 2015, the department received a petition for the potential establishment of an INA in San Simon. So in a period of about 3 or 4 months, from scratch, we generated a groundwater flow model that was used in San Simon to help make the decision. And then right on the heels of that, we built the Wilcox groundwater flow model, which I'll discuss in more detail. And then we also have a couple of first-generation models out in Yuma, you can see out there. And then we have an older version of the Upper San Pedro model. Great. You can turn it. Thank you. Yeah, and then some other models that the department was involved with to an extent with probably most of these, but they were developed by others. For example, our model was superseded by the Upper San Pedro model released by the USGS in 2007. The USGS also released the NARFA, which covers probably nearly half of the northern central portion of the state. It's a very large model. And then some other models up in the Four Corners area, the Aquifer, Black Mesa, McMullen Valley. Southwest Matrix developed that model, and then we also have a model developed for the Harquahala INA, originally by Hydro Systems, and it's been updated by Southwest. And then some of the models we have currently in progress, we have big plans for modeling the upper and middle San Pedro River. For whatever reason, flood recharge, which is a very important component and signal in that model, was never modeled, so we're going to do that. Among other things, the USGS several years ago published a 1-layer model of the northwestern basins, including Wallapai. Jeff and I actually worked with some consultants, and we used that model heavily in a recent assessment of groundwater conditions, answering some questions posed by the legislature in the last session. And then the Coconino Plateau, the CNR aquifer were modeled based on the USGS's Norfolk model. And then currently Prescott Valley and SRP have contracted the development of a big Chino model, sort of an embedded version of the existing Norfolk model. Yeah. And so about a year ago, a little over a year ago, we released the report for the Wilcox groundwater flow basin model. It's a large model, model cell resolution mile by mile, but when you look at the grid, you see lots of cells. So this encompasses a large area. In developing the model, I sort of partitioned it in the area north of the playa and the aquifer south of the playa. North of the playa, the aquifer, although there certainly could be some local aquatards and relatively shallow transit water systems, north of the playa, the aquifer, all the water levels tapping into the productive aquifer it's basically the same aquifer. We do not have a multiple aquifer system up to the north. But as you move to the south in the Kansas Settlement Sunsites area, the aquifer, it's a multi-aquifer system. Most of the high production wells are in the lower system, but we also have an aquitard that creates what we call an upper alluvial aquifer as well. So it's that upper system that receives the incidental agricultural recharge, which we'll talk about in a little while. The boundary conditions of the model, I actually extended them far north of the basin divide. It actually extends into Aravaipa because Aravaipa provided a very nice clean flux boundary condition, a flux target for the model, so I could use that as a target. And we also exploited the fact that it's a closed basin. It's a closed groundwater flow basin, so we could actually use it for a pre-development groundwater flow target in that it's basically a stagnation point. So that helped constrain the model much quicker than if I would have calibrated it completely dependent on water levels. So when we build these models, we look for different kinds of targets, whether they're aquifer test data targets or flow target data, and then of course we have water level target data as well. Right. Yeah, that's good. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the simulated water budgets for Wilcox. So the budget you see on the left-hand side represents the Wilcox Basin when it was pretty close to pre-development conditions. That period was, we categorized it in 1940. That was a period where we had a good wide sweep of groundwater level flow targets. And so I can't overstate the importance of initializing a model correctly with steady state, because if you start off on the wrong foot, then the transient calibration will inherently have errors that have to be mitigated, and you usually end up biasing a model. So that first budget is very important because that sort of sets the stage for conditioning the system. It really lets you know what the pre-development natural recharge conditions are, the pre-development groundwater discharge conditions are. And so you can see the budget. When I developed the model, again, this model is completely, we use a technique called nonlinear regression, and it's completely dependent on observation target data. We try to remove the modeler as much as we can. We can't get rid of the model bias, but we try to really have it predicated on the data and data alone. And so you can see that the figure associated with that budget on the right shows different colors, and those different colors represent the natural recharge conditions in the basin. And during development, I experimented with different delineations of aerial recharge sites. And this model is significantly different than the San Pedro to the west and the Santa Cruz to the west in that most of the natural recharge occurs in mountain front and or mountain block recharge areas. The exception is some of the tributary recharges, tributaries coming off the Chiricahuas, Turkey Creek, and some of those others. So the total, and really the pre-development conceptual recharge estimate for the Wilcox Basin came in right at around the calibrated value. So that calibrated value is completely predicated on observation data, and it was consistent with the conceptual estimate, so that was a positive attribute when we were developing the model. And so most of the recharge in the Wilcox Basin comes from the Chiricahuas and then the Penalenos to the north. Very little recharge, natural recharge, is contributed from the mountain ranges in the southwestern portion. And then also during model development, to really better understand the sensitivity of the natural recharge parameters in the context of the whole model, I actually established recharge zones inside the valley just to see if the model would be receptive, if the data and the model would be receptive to imposing natural recharge along the valley floor. And with both the San Simon model and with the Wilcox model, the data clearly absolutely shows that there is very little, if any, natural storm flow recharge entering the system in the basin. The data does not support it, but we don't see that condition in the Santa Cruz or San Pedro. And so the budget on the left describes, the inflow and the outflow components. There is no storage loss because the system is considered in equilibrium. That's how we condition the model. And so the inflows and outflows were approximately 44,000 acre-feet a year. So those parameters are basically tuned to the system. And then we moved to the transient system after 1940, and that's when I talk about the transient simulation. And the transient simulation budget, I'm talking about the period between 1940 and 2015, which is what the model is calibrated through. And so the budget in the middle represents long-term annualized mean rates. And so once you introduce groundwater development in the form of wells, we simulate groundwater pumping from the wells, it modifies the system. And then the model basically is just a really fast, obedient accountant, and it keeps track of all this information. So the long term, again, we have significant variation in rates over time, so I just sort of categorized everything into a generalized mean rate. So what we ended up with between 1940 and 2015, the average, long-term average well pumpage in the basin was about 136,000 acre-feet a year. And so when you impose that kind of pumpage, even with adding incidental recharge, which was also used as an estimated parameter, we ended up with a significant loss in storage. And so the long-term mean annualized net change in storage is 76,000 acre-feet a year. So every year, on average, we're losing that much water from storage, which is completely consistent with the water level changes that we see with the observation data. And then the report, by the way, we have an online version of this report if you don't want to print it out, but we talk about this information in much more in significant detail, as well as these budgets. And then the final budget represents both the calibration period and then the projection period, which was from 2015 to 2115. And we basically just retained the existing anthropogenic stresses, pumping and a component of the recharge that was calibrated. We extended that pumping rate out into the future, and you can see when it accrues over that additional period, we see a much larger change in storage. So the mean long-term rate is almost projected to be 150,000 acre-feet a year. So I threw a lot of stuff at you. You guys have any questions?
I can't see the last column, but the amount of water in the basin, the middle column is 5.7 million acre-feet. Is that what I'm?
That's the cumulative change in storage is, yes, Madam Chair, it's 5.7 million acre-feet. Right.
And the one on the right is what?
It is 15 million acre-feet. So that's a combination of calibrated period all the way from 1940 to 2115.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any
question, Madam Chair?
Yes.
How does that kind of change in storage compare to the total storage of that particular basin groundwater flow system?
I'm sorry.
How does that total storage change compare to the total storage of that particular basin's groundwater flow system?
The total storage in the Wilcox Basin is very significant. I don't have the number offhand. I believe there's a part of this report that actually talks about the total volume left in storage. Again, these are relatively deep basins, so it represents a relatively small component of it, but it is the upper portion of the aquifer that we see the changes in. I don't know if I answered your question.
There's another handout. Yes.
There is a lot of information contained in this presentation, and I just looked at EDWR's website. I didn't see it posted. Will it be posted so that we can read it in greater detail?
Yes.
Thank you.
It's been available since we released it, but yes, we'll definitely get that out. Okay. Perfect.
The name of the report, would you repeat that, please?
It's just the groundwater flow model of the Wilcox Basin, published July 16th, 2018.
Any other questions? Thank you.
And this just represents pumping over time series graph of pumping. And so we have the conceptual estimates in blue, which are just that. They're conceptual estimates. They're subject to change. And then during model development, some modifications were made based on, the model fit to the target data, and we made some modifications to the pumping based on the calibration itself. And you can see during the projection period, water levels in some areas of the simulated aquifer drop below a certain, the well, an assigned well threshold, and we lose pumpage that way. And that, again, that's just, it's a byproduct of the projected simulation groundwater levels declining, and at some point they decline below the bottom of the wells, and so no more pumping can be removed. Yeah, so you can see the decline. Some of them start around 2060, and again, that's just a product of groundwater levels dropping in the model. Turn it. And so, really, there is no way to sugarcoat some of these. These are observed water levels. These are not simulated. The simulated water levels match this pattern very clearly. This is the northern, I call it the northern aquifer, the aquifer north of the playa. And again, this aquifer doesn't appear to have any regional scale aquitards, so all of the high production wells pretty much tap into the same groundwater flow system, and we see this sort of decline. So the range of long-term declines of observed data in this northern area range from about 100 feet to almost 200 feet the further north you go. And then we move down to the southern area. This area has seen some of the most significant and continuingly significant declines anywhere in the state. All the index wells in the general Kansas settlement area, and we've added many index wells in that area as well, and they all say the same thing. We're now clearly over 300 feet, 330 feet or so long-term declines in that area. They're very significant. And it represents a lower system. There is an upper aquifer system that receives incidental recharge from the agricultural fields, and that is assimilated into the model. But because it's an aquitard, the hydraulic connection between the upper system and the lower system, where most of the production occurs, there's a significant impediment to flow. So that's another reason why we see, with these deep screen wells in the Kansas settlement and Sunsites area, that's why we see these significant declines. It's working under a confined, semi-confined pressure as well.
Madam Chair.
Oh. Yes, Senator.
Thank you. I saw a report that was published by NBC in a video, and I'm sure many of you have seen it as well, and if not, I'd be more than happy to share it with you. And it talks specifically about Wilcox and some of the corporate farms that have come in from out of state. So I'm wondering if you have noticed sharper declines in just the recent years, starting around, I would say, 2015. and around that. Have you seen, because we're looking at a 10-year decline, but did you see a sharper drop in the last 4 or 5 years?
You're very observant, yes. In fact, the model, the simulation terminated in 2015, but I had trouble during development simulating those sharp declines, and so that's why one reason we added additional wells to the index lines, just to validate that intense decline rate. And you're right, in that some of these areas are seeing decline rates of 3, 4, 5 feet a year. And what's significant about it is that this is a massive aquifer. This is a large area, and so systemically all these water levels are dropping. So I think that the pumping has exacerbated that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I have one more question. Right now there's 7,453 wells in the Wilcox Basin. Is that correct? Recent number?
I don't have a specific total.
So of that number, how many of those approximately are deeper than 900 feet?
I don't have, we can get to that answer, but I don't have that.
I think it's over 350, and I was just asking because, you know, and concerned for the residents and the smaller farms in the area. So, thank you.
Thank you. And so here's an animation I made to illustrate some of the changes over time. This will show you the transition from 1940, basically pre-development, all the way through 2115. And the warm colors represent declining groundwater levels over time. So you can start that down. I think there's a button there. I also made this graph to impress my son and his friends. They're gamers, and they think what I do is boring. So I didn't succeed in impressing them, but they didn't laugh at me. So. And this we have, if you go to the electronic version of the report, you can click on, there's a link that lets you observe this as well if you're interested.
They didn't think that was cool.
Well, it's sort of like Minecraft, I guess. I don't know. I don't know either.
Talk to your grandkids.
Yeah.
So I just stopped it at the end.
Okay.
There, if you want to say anything.
Yeah, so really, you can see the deep red represents the general Kansas settlement, Sonazona area, and that little pocket off to the southwest represents the Sun Sites area as well. And again, the lower system, it's working off of a confining pressure, so that's why we see these really significant declines. And again, when I develop these models, I don't like to put all my we like to evaluate multiple conceptual models, and every plausible conceptual model I built that was congruent with the data, they all showed a continuing steep decline in water levels, especially in the Kansas settlement area. The northern area, because it is unconfined, it works off of specific yield instead of specific storage, and so the cone can propagate out further, actually. And we have some index wells north of the Wilcox-Aravaipa Basin divide that actually show the cone of depression from the Wilcox Basin propagating out and impacting some of the index wells to the north. So this pumping is very significant and prolific, and it just whips out and spreads. Whereas the playa itself, that's why you see a sharp contrast between the playa and the red area, because the playa is basically an impermeable or very low what we call hydraulic conductivity, and it acts like a negative boundary. So if you pump it, you're not going to be able to have the cone of depression propagate out. It'll hit that boundary, and so the declines will be exacerbated, and so that's why we see that sharp contrast. And then getting to the story of recharge again. We have different forms of recharge. In the Wilcox Basin, an important recharge component is indeed incidental recharge. which we apply to the uppermost active layer of the model domain. So that is definitely taken into account. There are no artificial recharge facilities in the Wilcox Basin itself. And then getting back to natural recharge, I'm going to talk about differentiating mountain front recharge and recharge from ephemeral streams with respect to recharge towards major rivers. So we'll move on and I'll illustrate that here. So, no, this is fine. So this is a cross-section of an area of the San Simon model. And the San Simon's, it's a really interesting area. There was a true, really significant artesian aquifer system. It was discovered, I believe, in the teens. And by 1915, there was already a significant number of wells tapping the artesian system. They did need a pump, basically. And so when I designed the model, I knew I would need to get recharge from mountain front and or mountain block areas into the confined aquifer system. And so some recharge stays sort of superficial and up on top, but then some of the deeper mountain block recharge goes into the lower system. But the lower system is basically topped off by a clay unit, and that clay unit is basically an aquitard. There's very little, there's high resistance to flow in the aquitards in the clay unit, and so in the case of San Simon, when you drilled past the upper unit and past the clay unit, you uncovered this system under pressure. But after years and years of decades and decades of pumping and dewatering and depressurizing, the heads are pretty much at equilibrium now. But so this system also exists in Wilcox too, in the southern portion of Wilcox. So some recharge stays up on top for tributaries, but a significant amount of it goes down into the confined aquifer. But because this is such a large, massive buffered system, you know, the recharge rates compared to the pumping rates are relatively small. And even though the Wilcox Basin has relatively high mountain front recharge rates with respect to other areas like in the northwest or in the west, even those relatively high mountain front recharge rates, which came in at about 40 to 50,000 acre feet for most plausible models, they're just so overwhelmed by pumpage. That's why we see those significant overdraft numbers and those significant change in storage numbers. Go on. Does anybody have any questions about that before we move on?
Excuse me, how deep is that confined aquifer? How far down are we talking, you know, to get through the clay unit and then down into?
It varies. In the Wilcox area, I believe, it changes over space, but I believe it's about 300 or 400 feet down below the bottom of the aquitard. So this is technical. I don't want to get into a technical argument. We modeled it what we call implicitly, where we have vertical flow as an independent parameter, independent of horizontal flow. So it's sort of treated as an implicit impediment to vertical flow. But and so wells that are screened down low will be removing water, and that release of water will be subject to, you know, changes in specific storage. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
You mentioned that it's a massive basin. How deep is the basin?
It's very, again, that changes over space, but it's a deep basin, and I didn't truncate it, so it goes down quite a ways.
Like what?
It's a couple thousand feet at least. We can get that information for you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, I have a question too. What are we basing our mountain front and ephemeral stream recharge on? Precipitation?
We're basing it completely on observation target data, groundwater level target data. So we introduce it as a variable, but then we let the data really define what it is.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's, again, you know, precipitation and stream flow patterns, and that's all part of it. We do modulate in some of these plausible models. We do modulate it over time. You know, as most of you folks know, the period from the mid-late 70s to the mid-90s with respect to day was relatively wet. So some of these models we imposed higher recharge rates during these wet periods. But at the end of the day, really it's all the model calibration is predicated on, you know, having good target data. And so that's what we base it on.
So when we run the model, we have a model run, we are taking into account changes that we've seen in precipitation.
Yeah, right. Yeah. in the Wilcox Basin.
Or lack thereof for a 20-year drought.
Go to the next slide. I'll maybe make it more, well, doesn't go up here. Aravaipa. So if you look at the figure on the left, northern boundary condition, which is up to the northwest. Yeah, right here. This was the only area that was really sensitive to like seasonal changes or annual cyclical changes because the system responds so quickly to these changes. But once you move out into these big wide areas in the San Simon and Wilcox, the point recharge sites are really buffered by both space and time, and so the changes you see at mountain front areas, it attenuates and the signals become less pronounced. But to the northern portion, they're very sensitive, and that's a good segue to my discussion regarding the figure on the left-hand side. So the map in yellow represents a map developed by Freethy and Anderson from the USGS, and it shows pre-development groundwater head contours. And so the San Simon Basin is over here, and you can see the pre-development hydraulic gradients. They're relatively flat. They go from north or from south to north, and then also in the Wilcox Basin in the middle, you can see how the head contours, they're relatively flat. So when you do get these mountain front recharge events, rain occurs on the Chiricahuas and the Penaletos, Winchester Mountains, you see the recharge occurring right at mountain front areas, and it doesn't necessarily propagate into any inner valley areas. In contrast, the San Pedro, you see all these tight contours. You can see how both groundwater flow and surface water flow converge towards the San Pedro River. So that's why there are many gauges on the San Pedro River which show water levels responding to flood recharge. And so when big events come in, you see these recharge pulses that get reflected in water level changes, which you can use as targets. So that's why the recharge mechanisms for the San Pedro are pretty fundamentally different than the recharge patterns established for San Simon and Wilcox. And it's largely due to Mother Nature and the topography and the fact that in the San Pedro, when you get these big events, flow converges toward the river, and if there's storage space available along the river, then it will accept recharge. Whereas the other one, it's just pretty much, you can almost think of it as just like a bowl, and you got these recharge components, and they keep feeding the system. But in the case of Wilcox, the groundwater pumpage has been so significant, the recharge can't keep up with the pumpage. And this is just a diagram that shows the proliferation of dry cells. The blue figure represents layer 1 in near pre-development conditions. The blue lines represent, this is a multi-aquifer system or multi-layer model. So the blue lines represent flow from the lower system upwards to the upper system. And then the red lines represent over time, over the transient period, we see significant declines. And then when the water levels, simulated water levels drop below that certain screened elevation or how we assigned it, the model cell goes dry and we lose it.
Find that those are the dry cells.
Yeah, the caramel-colored cells just represent the number of model cells in layer 1 that went dry for this particular model. And so again, it's a reflection of the water level just dropping, and then once it gets below what we define that threshold at, it just goes dry and we lose it. So, yeah. And finally, I think this is my last slide. I created this slide a couple of years ago as an afterthought, but everybody seems to like it because it sets the story pretty straightforward. So it's comparing water budgets for 5 different areas in the state, and they all have different personalities. The Pinal AMA, of course, is agricultural dominated, significant pumping. And before CAP, we had a significant long-term change in storage overdraft rate. It looks like our mean annualized net change in storage pre-CAP was coming in at over 350,000 acre-feet a year. But then, with the introduction of CAP water, groundwater pumping was significantly relaxed, and then we had the importation of CEP. And so the system right now, just a snapshot in time, we're probably pretty close to equilibrium in Pinal. But if we didn't have that CAP, of course, the numbers would be significant. We'd have a significant change in storage. Tucson AMA, a similar story. It's not quite as significantly pumped as Pinal. So a pre-CAP long-term change in storage rate for the Tucson AMA was about 120,000 acre-feet a year. But, of course, with CAPSAR and ZAPSAR in Abra Valley, it sort of evened out. And I think currently right now, the Tucson AMA is probably right on the fence, pretty close to equilibrium thanks to the renewable supply. Santa Cruz AMA, it doesn't have renewable supplies in the traditional sense, but it gets significant flood recharge. Most of the pumping occurs like in San Pedro and the Inter Valley, and so if storage space is made available, the next wet period comes in, you'll have enhanced recharge. And we move over to the areas that do not have renewable supplies, San Simon and Wilcox. And again, a lot of this information is presented in these books, but you can see the significant overdraft numbers. Again, the mountain front recharge rates for San Simon and Wilcox, they're relatively high, but they just can't keep up with the pumping, and hence the overdraft. And so right now we're looking at long-term changes, long-term about 76,000 acre-feet a year in the hull for Wilcox, and then about 35 for San Simon. Any questions?
So that wraps up the modeling specific portion. So yeah, I will take any questions before we move on.
Several years ago, there was an application for non-expansion irrigation district, and could you tell us what the results of that was?
Oh yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. The results were that we did not establish an INA. The model results and data showed there are declines occurring, but the director decided against it. So water levels, they were falling, but there was apparently enough significant aquifer storage space left that that decision was never made.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I have a question. Yes. This actually relates to, I think, Jeff's first part of the presentation. We saw some slides that gave us some percentages as far as pumping capacity for non-exempt wells, both outside and inside of AMAs, and it was significant portion. But when we're talking about pumping capacity, what's that based on? The size of the pumps, and how is that related to actual water pumped from those wells?
So pumping capacity, as I stated, was when someone files an NOI, they're supposed to put a planned capacity, what they believe that they will be pumping from the well. So it's just an estimate before they've even drilled the well. The other place where pumping capacity can be provided to the department is after the drilling of a well and after a pump has been installed, and if they submit a pump completion report. So those are the pump capacity data that is provided to us, and not every well application or every well that's drilled has that provided. So it's on the onus of the well owner and the driller or pump contractor to provide those. So that is what pumping capacity is. Then there are reported pumping volumes, which are required in INAs and AMAs. So that is a different set of data that is provided to us, but only for certain portions of the state.
And it's my understanding that we don't require metering on all non-exempt wells. All non-exempt wells in the state, correct?
On all of them?
Right.
I don't believe so. I'm going to defer to our wells department on that.
Okay.
But there has to be some type of reporting provided for the AMA wells.
Right.
And I believe some are estimated, but they're obviously the best way to do it is through a meter.
I was just wondering how many outside of AMA non-exempt wells are metered versus not metered, and if they're significant or not.
Well, so the other across the state, community water systems are required to report theirs. So if there's any of those system wells would have to report, but non-exempt wells outside of AMAs are not required to report.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, follow-up question.
Okay, yes, and Stephanie's next.
Thank you. Related to the pumping from wells either in an AMA or outside of an AMA, is there a requirement, or how many of those wells actually have a pumping test, as opposed to just a maximum volume that the well will be able to withdraw based on the pump?
To answer your question specifically, there's only a small percentage of pump tests, pump completion reports are provided, is my understanding. How many there are, I have no idea. Versus what was the other?
Well, it's either in or outside of AMA, so it's not a requirement when a well is drilled and developed that a pump test be conducted.
For an exempt well, less than 35 gallons a minute.
Well, either exempt or non-exempt.
So yeah,
there is for non-exempt. There is required reporting, but for exempt wells, there is not.
And yeah, the requirement is a completion report. The pump test or the pump completion report is an additional submittal if they choose to do that.
So I guess what you're saying is it's not a requirement for non-exempt wells.
Yeah. Yes, is the answer.
That it is not. Repeat that. For non-exempt wells, it is not required. For non-exempt.
A completion report is required. That's the well completion report.
Okay. Usually when a well is drilled, the well driller will run the pump and give that estimate as to what they're, at least the ones that I've been involved with, and on properties that the well driller will bring in the pump and run it and report that amount.
Madam Chair, yes, there could be the driller could do that, or there could be pump companies that can come in after the fact, after it's drilled, and install the pump and then do a pump test on it.
Stephanie?
So the modeling from this full report is based upon well application data and maximum pump capacity, not on actual outflow.
Yeah, the pumping data, because Wilcox in this particular case, we don't have pumpage on the meters. It was originally based on power divider methods till about 1990, and then we started off with crop survey estimates to quantify the pumping. In other words, if data shows crop probably used X amount of water, over time, that we started out with that initial value when we calibrated the model, and then through the model development process, we refined that. So, yeah, so outside of AMAs, we don't have the luxury of Roger information to use, so we have to use other methods.
So,
except for water companies, and that is reported.
So what would be the percentage off of? In terms of if you had the actual data versus what you're making assumptions with?
Well, I know is in the report I list all the assumptions, and I talk about, plausible ranges of pumping. And again, we're talking about both space and time. So there is some liberty when you're developing a model to modify the pumpage, because even with, meters on pumps, there is a certain amount of uncertainty in error. So. But the numbers we're coming up with are pretty consistent with, again, conceptual estimates on that front.
I'd like to add to that so the U.S. the department hires the U.S. Geological Survey to go do field verification in certain basins, and it's not every year, but we do it regularly, and they provide they go out and see what crops are being grown, what the irrigation methods are, and they will work up an amount of water withdrawn to meet those cropping patterns. So that's generally the best information we have outside of areas where required reporting is in place.
Yeah, in this particular model report, too, I do discuss, I actually present results for several alternative conceptual models, with the understanding that, pumping is inherently uncertain. So, but we basically found a sweet spot, where plausible ranges are, and there's no way we can hit the calibration if we impose pumping rates that aren't consistent with those real steep declines we're seeing there. So that's sort of it's part of the art form of modeling. We have to calibrate everything concurrently, not just the pumping rates, but also the recharge coming in, the hydraulic properties of the aquifer, the hydraulic properties of the aquitard. So it's all part of a system that works together. But at the end of the day, the pumping rates we impose to the model, or the range of pumping rates are very consistent with other available data.
The Wilcox Basin public meeting that was held over there, was it in Bowie?
It wasn't part of it, yes.
Okay, it was standing room only, and a lot of historic data was submitted at that time from the farmers over in that area that had been there for quite a while. But it was a good meeting, and like I said, it was standing room only, and it went on and on and on. Senator?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A quick question, well, actually two questions. How long does the application process take, especially concerning that Wilcox area, for a well? And have you seen a sharp increase in well applications in the Wilcox districts for deeper wells?
Senator, I don't have the licensing timeframes in front of me on how long we have to review and approve the notice of intent to drill applications. I assume that's what you were referring to. We try to turn them around within weeks, so to do it quickly. They are valid once issued for 1 year, so they can drill the well anytime within a 1 year period, and then the completion report from the drillers are supposed to be submitted within 30 days after completion of the well. And then what was your second question?
Thank you. Yes, it was just about increase in number of deeper wells, and specifically in the Wilcox area.
Yes, and we don't have that information in front of us as far as the number of wells that have been recently drilled and their depths. We can provide that. We're actually working on that. I think you were at the La Paz County meeting the other day, so we're looking at that for other areas, and we can add this to our list of data to provide.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman?
Yes.
On the cropping patterns, how you determine that, you said you don't do it every year, so how does the model work? Do you pick a time and then you set that, or does it move every so often?
Yeah, the model report, we have quite a bit of information discussed about the crop patterns over time. So all that is taken into account. Now, whether these changes occur at a yearly basis, we probably don't have the model sensitivity to justify that. But, yeah, they're based on aerial distributions and assigned pumping. And for this particular model, because the area in the model is so large, each model cell is 1 square mile So sometimes we have multiple wells within one model cell, and so they sort of have to get integrated into a certain rate. So there is, I don't oversell these models. I don't overplay my hand. There is an inherent uncertainty with these results, but the results we're seeing, they sort of form an envelope of certainty about the ranges. So again, we discuss this in detail in the report if you're interested in looking at some of that information.
One more question that I had. When you have your test wells out there, and in that particular area, the local people were asked if they wanted their wells monitored, and you've got a lot of people that volunteered to have their wells metered. So for the agriculture community, do you test those wells during growing season or non-growing season, and what kind of adjustments do you make there?
Yeah, for the Wilcox model, I actually did include seasonality because, typically there's more stress on the system for the summer crops. And so, again, that's discussed within the report as well. So, yeah, if people let us measure their wells, that's a wonderful thing because, again, the model is completely dependent on observation data. And the more data we have, the better, the more accurate the model will be. So.
And I got copies of those applications at the time, and a lot of those people had just moved into the area 2, 3, 4 years. And if you don't know how to live on a well versus a city water company, there is a drastic difference in usage. You don't take your showers and do the dishwasher and laundry and outside watering and everything at the same time. You have to space your usage. And so a lot of people moving into rural areas are not used to living on a well and don't know how to, same thing with septic systems. So there's an education to the public that would be very helpful.
Madam Chair, if I may add, on our index line, when we have the DWR staff go out and collect water level measurements, we try to do that in the non-summer season so that we don't include the current effects of pumping. We want to try to have data that's not being influenced by pumping directly. So we try to avoid collecting those water levels in times of pumping. It's not always possible, but that's what we try to do statewide when we measure our index wells.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? We need to move on. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks for bearing with us on modeling is not an easy, it's pretty complicated, and so it's hard to not get into the weeds at times. So the last few slides here that I'm going to run through, I'm going to focus on here, just looking at water demand and supply and potential imbalances, and just kind of give a precursor to further discussions that this committee will have. And I want to start by talking about the strategic vision that the department put out in 2014. A lot of the information included in that publication came from the WRDC effort that was done in 2010. And basically some of the details that came out of that effort, that there are 30 basins around the state are projected to have supply deficits by 2035. The demands that are statewide currently are around 7 million acre-feet a year. That grows to an estimated 8 million acre-feet by 2035, and as much as 10 million acre-feet or more by 2110. Based on that analysis and that report, and as reported in the strategic vision, that the imbalance statewide runs from roughly 1 million acre-feet in 2035 up to over 3 million acre-feet by 2110. And I know this map is washed out, so I won't I'll just tell you what it really suggests. 36 out of the 46 groundwater basins in the state are projected to have a deficit by 2110. The map, for those who can see it, the areas in light, they're light blue, there's here and here and here and down here, are the basins that don't have a deficit at the end of 2110. And we're talking only 10 or so basins. So the basic takeaway from this is that there are large portions of the state, both in populated areas and especially in rural areas, where we have imbalance concerns that are going to grow over time.
Madam Chair, could you take a question along the way?
Yes.
How do you define have a deficit, have a water supply deficit?
Yeah. I was not involved in preparing the report, but I was just told that it's the projected demands will exceed the projected supplies. Yeah, using population projections. So it is a projection-based analysis.
And Madam Chair, and that assumes that we can pump down to 1,200 feet, our assured water supply number. Was that part of your assumption?
Well, again, this was part of the, was not.
Assured water supply.
Yeah, it was.
Taken into consideration.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
That's good, and thanks for defending something you didn't prepare yourself.
To that point, you all ought to read it because it is a good report, and it identifies, how much water is in each water basin, and I guess you're going to cover that, but, the things that are in, there's definitions, there's a history of all the things that the state has done referencing water from the 1800s, 1863, when the territory was established. There's some really good information, plus acronyms and abbreviations, and it's really a good history class. Y'all should take a look at it, along with maps, for the San Pedro, and is in here as well. So I have read it, and the full report is probably, 6 inches, 8 inches thick, and it makes a recommendation that we should renew this every 10 years. So we're half point right now.
Well, I have to point out that the strategic vision was done under former director Sandy Fabritz, who is here in the table. I was involved in that myself, so but I wanted to point that out, Sandy. So I'll move on. This is just something that our statewide planning section put together. I'm delivering it, but in the last decade, and especially since the WRDC and the strategic vision have come out, the department gets contacted by stakeholders and members of the public and water providers about issues and concerns that they have in their specific areas. We've listed a number of the areas that we have received input from, and then we've put circles up to kind of identify. And as you can see, it basically encompasses areas across the state. There are probably some areas that may be void of those concerns, but the point here is that there are a number of areas that have concerns. They include groundwater declines, lack of surface flow due to drought, lack of renewable supplies, poor groundwater quality. There are a number of different types of issues and concerns that have been raised to the department here, and just really wanted to point that out, that the department understands and that there's work that needs to be done around the state. And getting close to winding it up here, one of the things I wanted to point out in the strategic vision, there were a number of strategic priorities that were outlined to help minimize the imbalances, and the one I want to focus on that I believe relates to this committee is regarding comprehensive statewide data collection. I have another slide, I'll talk a little more about that, but one of the things that good data does is helps us do our models when we are putting those together and calibrating them. Just a couple of conclusion points here. As we stated, the imbalance, the supply and demand imbalance is growing in the state and projected to continue that way for at least 100 years. It's obvious that in rural areas and outside AMAs that there are challenges, and if those challenges are not met with trying to develop solutions, that it will be hard to resolve the situation, the issues, and the concerns. Looking back, kind of putting a number on how groundwater is, how important it is statewide. As I stated earlier, 31 of the basins in the state rely on at least 75% groundwater to meet their demands. And if you add the basins that have at least half of their demands met by groundwater, that number of basins increases to 40, so nearly almost all the basins. So really groundwater is a key component throughout the state. I don't think that's any big surprise, but just want to reiterate that. And as scientists and Keith will attest, the more and better data that we have, the better we can analyze the situation and come up with better solutions. So that ends our prepared presentation. We'll take some more questions.
Madam Chair?
Questions, yes.
Not so much a question, but a comment with regards to the WRDC Water Supply and Demand Report. It's hard to believe that that report's almost 10 years old already, and I think that based on the economy and everything that's happened within the state in the last 10 years, we've certainly seen some changes in the populations, that the projections that were used to put that report together, some of the uses and some of the demands. So it might be just something to consider, updating that report one of these days.
Okay, that was a comment. Anybody? Okay. The next item is best management practices. Is that right? Okay. A lot of things that are going on throughout the state. Particularly, I'm more familiar with, of course, my district. And so we did get reports from several cities. Could you tell me, or tell the committee, who has reported to you?
Yes, I believe, and Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we received information from Prescott Valley, and was it Flagstaff as well, or it was? So those are the three that we've heard from so far, Madam Chair.
Okay, if you could make those available. At the first meeting, we have, okay. I passed out what the city of Sierra Vista is doing, and I'll give you a copy for your records on that. New construction projects are required to install water-saving pumping fixtures. Commercial projects are required to use waterless urinals. Commercial development landscaping is limited to low-flow, drought-tolerant plants. Turf is prohibited in new commercial and limited for residential. Pools need to be covered. Hot water recirculating pumps on demand systems are required for all residential development. New car wash facilities must recycle 75% of their water. Water misters are prohibited, and fountains are required to recycle their water. Commercial and right-of-ways, landscaping plants must be from approved list of drought-tolerant plants. Commercial developments and residential subdivision must construct on-site detention basins that limit off-site storm flows. Sierra Vista has an environmental operations park that is credited with recharging more than 8 billion gallons of effluent into the aquifer since July of 2002. It recharges approximately 2,700 acre-feet of water to the aquifer annually, which is twice the amount Fort Huachuca pumps each year. 2012, $8 million was paid to upgrade the system, and the taxpayers were responsible for paying for that. They adopted a EPA water sense community, one of the first communities in the nation to adopt the Environmental Protection Agency Water Sense program. Stormwater management, they managed within the city of Sierra Vista, and water-wise education program in the schools and to the public. They have a conservation rebate program for toilet rebates. The program has replaced 4,500 commodes, saving 105 acre-feet of water annually. Supported replacement of high water use landscaping, and new water city facilities are included in rainwater harvesting system. And Cochise County has constructed the Palominas recharge, plus the Horseshoe Draw recharge. Some of you have been out to take a look at those. The city and Fort Huachuca is pumping significantly less now than it was in 1990. Nearly 65% of all the water activity mitigation efforts in the basin are being done by the city of Sierra Vista. And in 2000, the average per capita use was 180 gallons. In 2012, so this is dated as well, we're down to 141 gallons. And so I'm going to give that to you, and you can add that. I did hear back from Spencer Camps and the developers, and I'll give you this as well. The construction activity occurs on-site, designed so that all stormwater generated by disturbed areas in the site, exclusive of the public rights-of-way, is directed to one or more retention basins that are designed and retained for runoff from an extreme event. For the purposes of this subsection, extreme event means the rainfall event that meets or exceeds the local 100-year 2-hour storm event as calculated by the Arizona Registered Professional Engineering using industry practices. And this is in statute, and there's a copy of the statute here. So I'll give that to you. Several years ago, the department made recommendations on one of my bills, and it suggested, and all of this, of course, was voluntary, that I just went over, but a plan for the reuse of reclaimed water. Reclaimed water has the same meaning as what is in already the statute. It would be nice if they adopted residential and non-residential water conservation program for interior and exterior water use. An ordinance allowing only the use of xeriscape or other drought-tolerant and low-water use vegetation for landscaping, especially in the publicly right-of-way on a highway. Programs to provide rebates for both of the following, which was replacing low-efficiency plumbing fixtures and high-efficiency water landscaping. And so I'll give that to you as well. Maybe we can address that. But Cochise County and Sierra Vista and Fort Huachuca are doing an amazing job working with partners in the area for recharging and doing an excellent job. I know there's people around the table that are involved in that. I have some questions that, as far as things that we heard at the last meeting, that there were 30% loss in water pipes, water lines, and the goal was to bring that down to 10%. I think that is a major thing that we need to look at if we can correct that or help correct that. I think that would be definitely a step in the right direction. With all of these things that we've just gone over, and being more water, I use water a lot differently today than I did 20 years ago. We have programs in schools. We have the NRCDs go out and do water-wise inspections of houses or lots, commercial property, as to how to save water, as well as other programs in the community. 80% of the population lives in an active management area. So 20% do not. Out of that 20%, I'd like to know how many are living and using under a water provider other than an individual well. For instance, I have 8 acres, but if I lived in a subdivision, those lots are usually a quarter acre. So there'd be 4 houses per acre. Minimum home site in much of Cochise County is 4 acres, so that would be 4 times 4, 16 homes versus 1. I happen to have 8 acres, so times that by 2. You can't tell me I'm on an individual well, 1 household, that I'm impacting the use of 32 homes versus 32 homes that could be developed. And so let's find out who's using, who's living in a subdivision on a water provider. And there's a lot of small water providers, Nicksville, Whetstone, Naco, that are on water companies. And we need water companies. I'm not saying we don't. Versus the very small portion of us living on individual wells and the impact that we have. So I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. Anybody would like to add to it? Yes.
Hi, thank you, Madam Chair. I think you were speaking of one of the groups that we're a part of, the Nature Conservancy, along with Cochise County, Sierra Vista, Bisbee, and the Hereford NRCD, called the Cochise Conservation and Recharge Network. And we've been working for the last several years to recharge and replenish stormwater and effluent. And I think right now there's roughly 3,000 acre feet per year of effluent and stormwater being recharged. And I think the great thing about this partnership is that it's replicable around the state. So I know that members of that group would be happy to talk about the projects that they're working on, if that's something that the committee would be interested in. So, but it's a great, unique partnership that is protecting the water supply in southern Arizona.
Thank you.
I think as a committee, we need to perhaps provide a better definition of what our goal is as we evaluate these BMPs. Are we just to collect the data? Are we to promulgate? Are we going to look at it by planning area? I think it's a bit overwhelming to say we're going to recommend BMPs. BMPs have been around for a very long time. Some work better than others. How much additional conservation can be picked up is of a question. I think we need to do it, but I think we need to know how the committee would like to move forward with the discussion on BMPs. Sandy?
I think what we're doing right now, I'm sorry, Madam Chair and Madam Co-Chair, what we're doing right now is trying to get a sense of what's out there, who's doing what. I don't think we have a very good understanding on a global basis of who is actually employing conservation measures. I think we're finding more people are doing it than we thought in the past. So I think the path we're going on right now, at least collecting this information, is going to help inform us make that decision. I think it's premature to make any call at this point until we know what we have.
Okay, I can appreciate that. So how do we go forward on collecting the information? Do we request the stakeholders provide it again? Do we send out letters to Planning and Zoning Department, Natural Resource Conservation District?
Yeah, I can answer that. I think we're working on even a presentation from the ag community on what they do, the different counties and what they do. I truly believe that people want to be educated on how to best use their water, and I don't think they know. I know, until several years ago, my community wasn't aware. But with the education that we put forward, we just need, one of the comments, and I don't know whether I made it at the last meeting, but one of the hydrologists said, we're losing 95% of the water through evaporation. We're only saving 5%. Well, what would happen if we saved another 5%? I think that should be our goal, is regardless if we have a lot of water or no water, it's a resource we don't want to lose. And so finding out what the different organizations and industries use and how we can help them improve. I know in the Wilcox area, the farmers have implemented water-saving devices on their farms, and some of them have taken out loans on their farms in order to do it properly and take advantage of what is out there that they can do. So getting information from the agriculture community, the building community, the realtors. We used to give away water-saving devices for showers, and so we can find out what is out there that we can help with, and compile a list of all the best management practices, and suggest that we implement them. Stephanie, did you have something else?
I did, Madam Co-Chairs. I had something I wanted to share with the group. I guess, I had wanted to respond when the request was made for the best management practices. I thought that was a good request, because I was wanting to respond to several comments that have been made during this process that there's nothing going on in rural Arizona, that the only thing that's happening is in AMAs, and I think it was called the Wild West out there in rural Arizona. So I requested that the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the easiest, lowest hanging fruit in terms of gathering information that's going on. It's not an exhaustive piece of information, but it's a pretty good snapshot of what's going on. And so I just wanted, and I'll submit this to the committee for whatever compilation we're making. I won't have the granular level of data that I was hoping for until probably the end of the week. What I have now are totals, which haven't been vetted through the DC office, so I can only share them with the group this morning in terms of totals. But and this is statewide. So in terms of environmental quality incentives program overall, and the conservation practices that are most used that can be directly tied to water savings. So that's irrigation system improvements, irrigation water management. So that could be any kind of plan. That could be something else going on the farm in terms of leveling, some other practices that aren't directly an irrigation system. Brush management practices going on in the greater watershed, which obviously impacts water infiltration and groundwater collection. Prescribed grazing practices, which do the same. So in total, in terms of acres treated, roughly in the last 20 years, it's 31.4 million acres that have been treated in some way with some kind of water savings practice, and that equates to just about $127 million of federal funds that have put into Arizona, and that's just the federal side. So that could be a match anywhere from 25, 50, 75%. So that doesn't take into account the private investment that's been made from the farm or the ranch on that particular practice. Now, those are just the practices. On terms of the conservation technical assistance, now that's when the farmer or rancher didn't seek financial or any kind of funding for actually putting the practice in, but went to NRCS for basically technical assistance in figuring out which practice to do on their property, how to do it, things like that. But there was no federal investment. It was basically just knowledge investment. So for irrigation water management, that's 214,000 acres. Brush management, that's 183 almost 184,000 acres, and prescribed grazing is 13.7 million acres. So a total of just conservation technical assistance is over 14 million acres within the state. And again, this is just within the last 20 years. Other federal investments, which aren't even totally related to a farm or a ranch, you can look at watershed operations. So that's when the NRCS engages on flood control, flood retarding structures. They have 3 projects, almost $9.5 million investment. Watershed rehab, that's repair of existing flood retarding structures. That's 13 projects in Arizona for over 154 million. And just like the farming and ranching projects, these also include a 20 to 40% match from like a city or a county, some larger entity that's assisting with those flood control structures. So the report that I'm hoping to submit to the committee in the near future will have kind of a more granular level in terms of specifically a wider range of practices, so that would then raise the number of acres treated and also the federal investment, and also a general location of where around the state these practices are happening. So I definitely think it's worth focusing on the amount of conservation that's happening around the state and the ag industry that is completely voluntary.
Thank you. I know the mining industry does recycling, and they could. And can you hear me now? Okay. So getting something as to what they do, and forest management. I mean, we can create more wet water with proper forest management. State trust lands we talked about before. They're coming up with a study for locations for additional recharge projects on state trust lands. Stormwater management is always a biggie. Let's take advantage of it when we have it and recharge it. Sandy.
Just Madam Chair, sorry, just as a follow-up on the information that's available out there, I know that part of the community water system reporting as well, that there's a water conservation component to that where they have to report can't remember if it's every year, every 5 years, whatever it is, the water conservation measures that are being employed in those systems. So I think that's probably a really quick source of information, quote unquote, so the department should have on hand.
Good. Community water system. You've got that information. Those are the small community water systems. Stephanie?
I actually had a question going back to I don't know if we can go back to the last slide of the groundwater. Is that possible to go back, or you just take that down already? Anyway, basically what it said was there was a bullet point on there that basically said there are certain areas of the state with projected deficits that without any action would not be fixed. It didn't delineate which ones those are. So yeah, I think that's the one. Is that some groundwater supply concerns identified in areas outside MAs will not improve or resolve without intervention or solutions. So I guess not knowing what some groundwater, out of the 31 basins that were identified, or whatever the number was. I don't really know what some is or where those are. I'm guessing one of them is Wilcox, since we've focused on that so much today. But I guess my question is that kind of in thinking about that report as a whole, and as you said, Madam Co-Chair, that 80% of the population lives within an AMA currently, most of these areas are not going to see population growth like what has been included in all of these assumptions. Agriculture, in terms of an industry, is growing in Arizona in terms of its economic impact, but that's mostly because we're becoming more efficient with what we're doing and focusing very well on markets. So I guess my question is, after hearing this report, if there are so many, basically 3/4 of the state, that are facing this issue, and without intervention something's going to happen, if the population is not growing and agricultural acreage is basically staying at the same level, what are we really looking at here in terms of addressing the issue?
Madam Chair, I could answer that.
Patrick?
So from the Mojave County perspective, first of all, we applaud everybody for doing this work and for taking the time to plow through these difficult issues. We face a basin that's at risk today. And so we're proposing a basin-by-basin approach, and the legislature has been wise enough to start 2 study committees, one for Mojave County for our basin at risk, one for La Paz County. So we're proposing that we go basin by basin because they are so different. And the basin we face in Wallapai Basin has 6,000 acres of agriculture today. In 2010, had no agriculture, has lots of ranching, had a few vineyards, but now we're at 6,000, and the DWR report they did with Matrix that was reported on in August projects they'll have 57,000 acres of agriculture at build-out. That's a projection. Who knows if we're ever going to get there, but that's the land they own today. So the point at which we cross 1,200 feet, in which water is now below 1,200 feet, is 60 years away. And that's based on the Matrix study that was talked about, will be released in detail by December. We only got an oral recitation in August. That's buttressed by work done way back in 2015 by a registered geologist in Mojave County that said we have 55 years of water in that basin. That's the Wallapai Basin. It has 3 subbasins, and there's a lot of pumping out of the Kingman subbasin. The other 2 subbasins are doing a little bit better. So for basins that are at risk soon, I think all these groundwater ideas, best management practices, and this long list of topics for discussion, they're all on the table. For the other basins where we're not facing that kind of use, I think that we may have the luxury of time. But Mojave County feels for Wallapai, we don't have the luxury of time. And so we've got to figure out what to do, and we have a study committee to do that. This study committee, it seems to me, is for all the other basins that may want to come and talk about these issues and come up with useful tools that can be helpful. And Mojave County, way back in 2018, put on the table several ideas to try to figure out how much water is coming out of our basin. And in our presentation by Mojave County in August, we talked about a useful idea like gravity flow meters. Gravity flow meters don't require anybody to come to your property at all. We use literally gravity and good science to figure out where the water is in the basin so that we don't have to raise the issue of monitoring and metering. We also proposed way back in 2018 that we could always have estimates by groundwater users like we do in the community water systems. We just mentioned community water systems. They're allowed to meter or they're allowed to estimate how much water they're going to put on. Some farmers already in Mojave County have provided their data in the Mojave County Study Committee process voluntarily about what their plan is to pump. So for basins that are more at risk, these tools are really valuable now. And I think it's a sliding scale because there's a lot of basins that are not yet at risk, and maybe they have the luxury of 100 years. So, Madam Chairs, both of you, I encourage us to continue talking about all these good ideas. We can generate, hopefully, a report that has a menu of ideas, and then each community, their elected officials and their stakeholders can decide what do they want to press forward with, what do they not want to press forward with. Thanks.
Patrick, does Mojave County have any BMPs adopted?
Fast.
Would you submit them?
Yeah, we will. We will, and we made a presentation about them in August to the study committee, and we will submit them. But I think the one that maybe my friend Jamie is goading me into talk about is that the City of Kingman and Mojave County have adopted several years ago on a process through their flood control to do much more recharge of stormwater. And so we are building structures, and we are siting new structures that haven't been built yet, where we can use the foothills around the Wallapai Basin to recharge, because the center of the Wallapai Basin is all clay, and aquitard, as our colleague from DWR would call it. And so putting water in the center of that basin does no good. It simply evaporates. It doesn't recharge. So we've got to get water in on the edges, and so we're building those structures, and we're working with BLM to use some of their money, like Natural Resource Conservation Districts, federal money that's available. We want to tap into that. And then the City of Kingman and Mojave County are using some of their own money to do that kind of a recharge program. We hope to build many more of those recharge programs. City of Kingman alone uses about 15,000 acre-feet of water out of that basin every year. They had over 200 years of water in 2010. We recharge maybe 5,000 to 6,000 now through God. We've got to drive those numbers up and recharge more.
Good, and you've been doing that for how long?
2015 is when they really got off the ground. I think the first structure went into the ground maybe in 16 or 17.
Good, good. So maybe we can send a letter to the different counties to see what best management practices they have, as well as sending something to each of the cities to see what all they're doing. And the ones that need help, that's what we're here for, and maybe we can help them with that. And provide the partnerships that we at one time didn't have, and we now have with many different partners to do the right thing. Stephanie.
Madam Co-Chair, I just wanted on the record that didn't really answer my question, but that's okay. I guess we'll wait and see. I know what you're saying about your specific area, but it seems like we're going to spend an awful lot of time talking about a lot of areas that, unless God makes it rain, and we want to take some mandatory step with agricultural users or private property, I guess I see us talking around the issue quite a bit for a very long time.
Any other questions? It is now 11:57. We have 3 minutes. Is there anybody online that would like to, is anybody online? I forgot to ask that. I guess not. So we'll get out 3 minutes early unless, is there somebody online?
Jen Morrow from Finland. Hear me? Hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't understand you too well, but go ahead.
That's right.
I want to thank Patrick for his words, and just say that Kingman is also building our first injection well as part of our recharge efforts, and our effluent is going to be recharged. I just wanted to add that we are doing everything that you can think of to apply best practice conservation measures.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said. Can somebody tell me? The connection was not very good. Are you on a speakerphone?
Zach, were you able to catch that?
I'm hearing the chat. I just did chat. This doesn't work on the computer.
I do not have a text. I do have a text from my lovely wife. I won't read it to you.
Okay. Well, we're not quite finished with the agenda, so let me turn this over to co-chair.
We are out of time, so I will be quick. At the last council meeting, this committee received some instructions to expand out the topics. A list is included in the materials that were put in front of you. The important ones, right there. I think these are the ones that we brought that we had already decided on, but I don't know those. We added, they're on your paper. I won't take the time to read them to you, but it's the well spacing requirements, agricultural production areas involved in the adjudication, voluntary best measures, the need for more data, the identification of at-risk basins, which is Mr. Cunningham, the identifications of areas of interest in pursuing water adequacy requirements, the identification areas of interested in establishing INAs, tax incentives to motivate voluntary or cooperative reporting, removal of legislative impediments to self-governance in northern Arizona, addressing laws that drive use it or lose it, and the connection between groundwater and surface water, and compilation of groundwater issues of concern for particular areas of the state. I guess we'll take this up next time, and I think what I'm going to ask Karen to do is maybe to send out to each representatives from the planning areas the chapter from the strategic vision, so they can easily see what data DWR has already identified or what issues have already been identified. I mean, we might as well pick up and use the work that's already been done, and I just think if you're able to provide it to them, it'll make it a little bit easier for the committee to go forward.
Madam Chair, I now have the text from the mayor, so I know. What I forgot to say was the City of Kingman has planned and funded, and now they're in the engineering phase of an injection well that's going to cost them over $1 million to take their extra effluent from their Hilltop wastewater treatment plant, mechanical plant, and inject that all the way into the Kingman subbasin of the Wallapai Aquifer through that clay layer. So they're in engineering now to commence that work, and they've already funded it. So that's one of the best management practices that the mayor was politely reminding me to put on the record. Thanks.
Okay, great.
And Madam Chair, if I may, if everyone would send your best management practices to Karen, I will work with staff so that we can organize all of those and work with the chairs to see what we want to do, how we're going to feed those back to you, whether we do that in the form of a presentation or we compile them and send them all back out to you. We'll make a plan for how we do that.
Sounds good. Okay, we'll work on the next meeting. Looks like it may be November, first part of November, and we'll get back to you, but anybody have any questions, feel free. Our doors are open, so feel free to talk to us about any of the issues, and we look forward to working with you. With that, meeting adjourned.